Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Zayin Mishnah Daled. We're going to speak about a concept that many of us are familiar with called Ben Hashmashot, the period between sunset and nightfall when the three stars come out. Between sunset and when the three stars come out, it's legally in halakha considered an uncertain time. It could be possibly day and it could be possibly night. Therefore, on Friday night, this time period is possibly Shabbat. However, the Chachamim allowed us to tie Demai during this uncertain period, but not definite Tevel. And not only is it forbidden to separate definite Tevel during this time, it's even forbidden to verbally designate specific parts of the Tevel to be tides, because as the Rab tells us, identifying the parts that are being designated as tides is considered the same as separating them, and that is not allowed. The Mishnah now is going to teach us what can be done to permit Tevel during this time of Ben Hashmashot, or a person realized during the day, soon before the sun is about to set, that he did not separate it and he will not make it back to physically separate it. What can he do? So the Mishnah says, Halokech yain mi ben akutim. If somebody buys wine on Erev Shabbat from among the kutim we spoke about earlier in Perek Gimel Mishnah Dalid, that the kutim, they tithe their own produce only when they ate it themselves. When they sold it, they didn't bother to tithe it. They weren't concerned about causing other people to sin. The Rab told us this in Perek Hey Mishnah Tet. So the Rab tells us that their wine is considered 100% definite tevel. Therefore, when you buy wine from kutim, you even have to separate terumah from it. Unlike when you buy from Amaretz, we know Amaretz separate terumah. You only have to separate terumat maaser. So the Mishnah says, Halokech yain ben akutim. If somebody buys wine in Erev Shabbat from the kutim and he forgot to tithe it before sunset, when it now becomes asur to separate from definite tevel, he can do the following: Omer shnei lugin shaneti lafrish. In a case where he bought 100 lugin, now the Mefarshim point out to us that a lug, the plural form is lugin, it's a liquid measure that's equal to the volume of 6 eggs between 16 and 21 ounces. The Mishnah is going to use a case of 100 lugin of wine in order to make the math simpler. Omer, he says, Shnei lugin sheni atid lafrish. In a case where he bought 100 lugin of wine, he says, the 2 lugin of wine that I will separate after Shabbat, hare and tiruma, they're designated as tiruma as of now. Va'asara maaser, 10 additional lugin that I will separate after Shabbat are designated as maaser rishon. V'tisha maaser sheni, and then 9 additional lugin that I will separate after Shabbat are designated as maaser sheni. The Mishnah says, mechel v'shoteh, he can then begin to drink the wine immediately, as long as he will be careful to remove the designated amount of tirumah and maaser. Now, the Mefarshim point out to us that the Mishnah's numbers aren't precise. Why? Because after the 2 lugin that you designated as tirumah, you only have 98 lugin left. Now, the 10% of the remainder that's designated as maaser rishon is really 9.8 lugin. Likewise, after you remove this 9.8 lugin as maaser rishon, there's only 88.2 lugin left. Now, the 10% that are designated as maaser sheni comes out to 8.82 lugin. But again, for the sake of simplicity, the Mishnah rounds these numbers off to its nearest complete number, 10 for maaser rishon and 9 for maaser sheni. Now, the Mefarshim do point out to us that when you say that you're going to take out 2 lugin after Shabbat to count as tirumah, in this case, you don't actually set aside the wine that's going to become tirumah till after Shabbat. And also, the tirumah designation takes effect right away, but you won't know which 2 lugin to take out until after Shabbat. Once they're separate after Shabbat, it'll become retroactively clear that these 2 lugin were the ones that were designated originally. Why? Because you're drinking the wine and you're making sure to leave over 2 lugin. So we'll say that at the end, yesh berera, we're going to explain yesh berera, that retroactively we knew that this 2 lugin that remained over was set for tirumah. And again, like we said, the Mishnah says mechel v'shoteh, which the Rab in the first explanation explains matchil v'shoteh. He is then allowed to begin to drink the wine immediately, as long as he is careful to leave over the amount that he designated as tirumah and maaser. Again, like we said, this is based on the ruling of Birra, that a choice made at a later time can retroactively establish the legal status of something at an earlier time. So by me leaving over this wine at the end, the 2 lugin or the 10 lugin and then the 9 lugin, I am showing that this is really the tirumah, the maaser rishon, or the maaser sheni. Now, the Mefarshim point out that since The Mefarshim point out that after Shabbat, when you separate the 21 lugin that will be Tiruma and Maaser, you're retroactively determining which lugin were Tiruma and Maaserot for the entire barrel from the time you made the declaration on Friday evening. The rest of the wine was therefore permissible for him to drink on Shabbat. And since he didn't identify on Shabbat which lugin were the tithes, and he didn't actually separate them, the Chachamim were lenient and they allowed the declaration to be made in order to allow him to have the wine on Shabbat. Now, even this leniency was only permitted during Ben Hashmashot, during twilight period, between when the sun set and 3 stars come out, when it's not definitely Shabbat. But once the nightfall comes and it's definitely Shabbat, even the Mefarshim point out, even the Mishnah would say that even to see this formula would be asur. Now, the Mefarshim point out that since our Mishnah is talking about definite tevel, it's clear that the time of this Mishnah holds, you could say, yesh birera, retroactive clarification, even by biblical isurim. This is a machloket tanim, like we said. The actual halakha that Rav tells us is that we do not rely on birera for biblical laws, but only in rabbinical laws, like the cases of Demai that we spoke about in Perek Vav. Now, the Mefarshim, last comment on this Mishnah, the Mefarshim point out that in Mishnah Bet, we learned that a person who makes tithes, designate tithes in advance, the demai that he's going to drink on Shabbat, may identify on Shabbat that part that will become ma'asel, meaning what the person says, what I'm leaving at the bottom of the cup. The Chamim only allowed you to do this for a piece of a food or a cup of drink that's actually being consumed on Shabbat. But they didn't allow you to do it for an entire barrel, because much of a barrel won't be actually used on Shabbat. That is the Rabotai of Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Hey now is going to discuss another case in which a person is not able to physically separate the tithes from tevel produce before Shabbat. The Mishnah is going to say a declaration that he can make similar to the previous one to permit the tevel for Shabbat. If somebody had 100 figs of tevel inside his house, again 100 to make the math simpler. But on Erev Shabbat, he was in the Bet HaMidrash studying Torah, or he was working in the field, and he was afraid, the Rav says, that he won't come home in time to tithe the figs before Shabbat actually begins. Omer, he says, the 2 figs that I will separate after Shabbat, Hare and Teruma, they're designated as Teruma. Ve'eser ma'aser rishon, the 10 additional figs that I will separate after Shabbat are hereby designated as ma'aser rishon. V'tesha ma'aser sheni, and then the 9 additional figs that I will separate after Shabbat are designated as ma'aser sheni. Basically, the same declaration that we used in the previous Mishnah to designate the tithes for the wine, except the previous Mishnah was liquid. Now we're talking about solid foods, but again, it's the same halakha. And again, the Mishnah is talking about making the declaration even before Ben Hashmashot, not during Ben Hashmashot, but even before. V'tesha ma'aser sheni, like we said, the 9 additional figs that you're going to separate after Shabbat are the ma'aser sheni. He is then allowed to eat the figs on Shabbat, as long as, again, he leaves over enough of them to separate after Shabbat as the teruma and ma'aser that he designated. Again, this relies on the concept of yesh berera, retroactive clarification. Now, this text is only for definite tevel, produce that you do not tithe at all. But if the figs are only demai, they were purchased from an amaretz, then there's a different declaration you make. Why? Because when a person buys demai, he doesn't have to actually separate teruma. Because again, amaretz separated teruma. Only thing he has to separate is terumat maaser. Even the maaser rishon, he only has to designate. Therefore, you have to have a different declaration, a different statement. Hayu demai, if the figs were demai, not tevel, Omer, he says, Ma sheni atid lafrish, that 1 fig that I will separate, the Mishnah has lemachal in brackets, but it doesn't belong here according to the Mefarshim. So again, Ma sheni atid lafrish, that 1 fig that I'm going to separate, hareu maaser, that's the first part of the maaser rishon. Ushar maaser samuch lo, and then the other 9 figs next to it are designated as the rest of the maaser rishon, because again, since we're dealing with demai, the owner doesn't have to give away the maaser rishon. He only has to designate maaser rishon in order to separate the terumat maaser. Therefore, you begin by designating 1 fig as maaser rishon, and then making the other 9 the continuation of the maaser rishon. And then you say, with 10 figs or 10% of the pile now being maaser rishon, you say, Zeh she'asiti maaser asui terumat maaser. That alav. Zeh she'asiti maaser asui terumat maaser alav. That 1 fig, which I made into the first part of Maaser Rishon, is now made into Terumat Maaser for the other 9 figs of the Maaser Rishon. U'maaser sheni bitzfono bidromo. The maaser sheni for these 100 figs is designated either on the northern side of the pile or the southern side of the pile. U'mechulal al hamaot, and I'm now redeeming it onto coins that I set aside for this purpose. Now that you made this declaration, you can eat the figs on Shabbat, leaving over at least one fig that you're going to separate after Shabbat as terumat maaser. Now in Mishnah Aleph in this parak we learned that somebody who wants to tie Demai before Shabbat can say that the piece he set aside on Shabbat can become terumat maaser. But like we learned in the previous Mishnah, that leniency was only for someone actually tithing the Demai that he's going to eat on Shabbat itself. In our case, he's tithing his entire pile of figs. Most of it won't be eaten on Shabbat, so the Chachamim did not allow you on Shabbat to identify the portions that are Maaser. For this reason, you have to put off separating the fig that's going to be Terumat Maaser until after Shabbat. That is the end, Rabotai, of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen v'Amen.